Okay, everyone, thank you for coming out. Mike will present. We'll hear his thoughts about reform across the United States, and afterwards I'll sit down with Mike and hopefully have a discussion with him and with you all. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right, awesome. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Dr. Sam Wong, Diana Yi, and the whole Electoral Innovation Lab team who I had the privilege of meeting earlier today. So the topic, ranked choice voting and the future of electoral reform. I'll start with sort of the basics. So discuss the case for single winner ranked choice voting, how ranked choice voting works, how it helps address key problems in our democracy. And then in the back half, kind of discuss the landscape of ranked choice voting reform and where things are hopefully going next. So we'll see where they end up going. There are things I would like to see happen, but we'll see what you think. So first, why reform? We all really want the same kinds of things out of our government. We want to have faith that our elected officials will represent us well, be responsive to us, really represent the constituents that they serve. Here are some of the current pathologies in the US that we see in politics. Limited voter choice. We have vote splitting and strategic voting, right? If you've ever been wondering who should I vote for in this race, I like this person, but this other person seems more electable, so I'm going to vote for this person who's more electable. You've engaged in strategic voting, right? You're trying to make sure that your vote has a maximum impact, even though there's someone else you prefer more. Or you could have similar candidates splitting the vote, such that, say, a majority of voters actually gets divided between two candidates. A candidate supported by a minority ends up winning. So here, too, you have the potential for non-majority winners. Toxic polarization, known in the literature as affective polarization. So I think we're familiar with polarization, sort of the growing divide between the parties. Affective in particular is kind of the growing hatred and distrust between the different sides in our political dialogue, having it become more personal. So that is, I think, a pathology. Non-competitive elections, gerrymandering, lack of representation. I feel like I'll buzz through those given this audience. The folks who would turn out to this maybe have a sense of how these things are occurring in the United States today. So this is an example sort of the crowded fields that we see that can lead to potentially unrepresentative results. So on the left side, we have a Democratic primary for US House seat where the person who won the primary got 25.7% of the vote. All the rest of the vote was split among these other candidates. Would that candidate have gotten more than 50% if it was Daniel Golden versus any other candidate? We just don't know, right? There's kind of no way to know whether that candidate is the best representative of the Democratic Party in that House race. Similarly, in Pennsylvania, where I'm hailing from, we have the Senate race where the Republican primary, 31.2% to 31.1%. Split in the field and went on to the general. Was Dr. Oz the strongest candidate for the Republicans going into the Pennsylvania Senate race? Would voters have preferred someone else if they had the choice, had the option to express that? We just don't know. So here, again, you have a situation where you could have a candidate that actually is opposed by a majority of voters going on to win the primary, going on to win a general election because of vote splitting. There are solutions to this, historically, runoffs, especially sort of the traditional two-stage runoff. You've got all the candidates in the first, the top two go on to a separate election, and then you have a whole separate election that you run for those top two. Obviously, there's drawbacks to this as well. The biggest one being that there are typically fairly large turnout declines between the initial election and the runoff. So the average decline is 38%. So again, query whether you're having a representative electorate in that second lower turnout election that really is representing the voice of the people, especially because we tend to see in the data that there can be sort of demographic skews, age skews, economic skews between the original general election and the runoff, who shows up in the runoff. So is the runoff election, holding a whole separate election where you're asking people to come back out to the polls, is that solving the problem? And there's data point in the middle here, which is turnout dropped in 240 of the 248 primary runoffs for the House and Senate. So pretty infrequent that it stays level or goes up. So single winner ranked choice voting helps solve these issues. And I'll focus on the single winner aspect to start here. Offices like president, senator, governor, mayor, executive races where there's really one candidate, one office that you're seating, bunch of candidates vying for that one office. Under single winner ranked choice voting, voters have the option to rank candidates instead of picking one from most favorite to least favorite. And this, through the tabulation process, helps produce majority winners. So if no candidate ends up having a majority of the first choices, you essentially eliminate the least popular candidate and look at those voters' second choices. And you continue doing that until you end up having a majority winner. And so we consider it a simple change with powerful impacts for our democracy. Here's just a quick overview example, right? You have sort of the purple party kind of folks. You have rust-ish party kind of folks, salmon maybe. I don't know what that is actually. Darius, right? Nobody is above 50%. Darius is the least popular candidate in the first iteration, so you eliminate Darius. And whoever put Darius first on their ballots, it goes to their second choices. As you can see, most of Darius's voters preferred Berta, so most of those ballots transferred to Berta, but some crossed over. Some folks who were in the orange side said, you know what, I actually like Andy better, and those votes transferred. Still not to 50%, so eliminate again. Carla's voters overwhelmingly preferred Andy, and again, now you have a majority winner. You've eliminated the vote splitting problem. So where is RCV used? I still have this sense, having worked on RCV for a very long time, that it's like this plucky emergent reform. It kind of no longer is. It is the fastest growing reform in the United States. There are 13 million voters in the United States who cast ballots in ranked choice voting elections today. It's been used internationally for over a century. So it's not sort of new or untested or novel in that sense. But in America, it has been growing a lot recently and gaining traction, especially with the statewide uses in Maine and Alaska, and a lot of local uses. I believe it is 58 cities in use today, one of the largest, New York City, for their primary elections. So what does this do? How does RCV impact our elections? Promotes voter choice, right? You have more options to express what you think about the candidates, how you feel about the options before you. Again, solves the vote splitting problem, helps you avoid strategic voting, because if you like candidate A the best, but you don't think they're electable, you still get to rank candidate A first, right? You can put your electable candidate however far down you want, and if they end up being the most electable, it's going to go all the way down your ballot to that candidate. Promotes majority winners, helps improve campaign civility, which we'll talk about in a second here, has provided improved representation for women and people of color, and creates incentive for broader engagement with voters, which really interacts with this campaign civility point. So let's unpack. This is a lot. I know it's like, look at all the benefits of RCV. Let's unpack these, dig a little bit deeper. So the biggest takeaway is that voters who use ranked choice voting like ranked choice voting. In the initial stages, when people are considering a reform, there can be some hesitance, some status quo bias, people aren't sure. Once you have voted in a ranked choice voting election, we find people love it because they realize that they're getting to express themselves more fully, seeing the benefits of it in practice. So in New York City, right, it didn't pass by 77%, but once people started using it, they really liked it. So 77% of voters said they liked using it. 62% in Utah, 94% in Santa Fe. And we see good engagement with the ballot. So 71% of voters are ranking multiple candidates and using the ballot. Again, this helps voters vote honestly. 30-1 margin in Utah, where somebody said they felt freer to express their honest preference, and electing majority winners. So all winners, just by the way it works, end up having a majority of votes that are active in the final round. And 73% of voters end up with a winner who's ranked in the top 3. And I think that one's actually interesting because it may be that your candidate doesn't win, but if 73% of voters are seeing somebody they ranked in the top 3, that actually helps a little bit with this sense of consensus, this sense of unity, which is, you know, my number 1 didn't win, my number 2 didn't win, but this is somebody at least preferred third who is getting elected. I maybe have a sense of connection to them, investment in them, that I wouldn't have had if I was only voting for one and kind of viewing everyone else, all the other candidates as, say, the enemy, right? In terms of improving the tone of campaigns, I do want to pause here and say, politics ain't beanbag. So I think sometimes when RCV passes and there's some attack ads, people will be like, look, RCV isn't working. this person said this bad thing about this other person. So I don't expect all negative ads to go away, unfortunately, even in jurisdictions that adopt ranked choice voting. But it can, various different studies have shown that it actually can improve civility. And I think, frankly, moving in the right direction is really what we're trying to get at right now. So this comes from voter surveys of Virginia Republican primary voters, voters in Santa Fe. It comes in analysis of different debates and campaign literature, showing that candidates use more positive words referring to other candidates than negative or neutral words, compared to the average use of positive words in single choice elections. And honestly, I think the biggest indicator of this isn't actually sort of our analysis of positive word usage, but simply the quotes from candidates themselves and the actions of candidates themselves. So you've seen in various instances candidates in a split field who will form an alliance and say, I think you should rank me first, but if you don't rank me first, I'm endorsing this other candidate in my race second, right? And this other candidate says, I think you should rank me first. And if you don't prefer me, go to this person. Wild when you think about a single choice election, right? That would never happen. But what ranked choice voting does, it actually creates this reason for coalition to say, I think this person would actually carry the torch that I would like to carry. And if it's not going to be me, I'd prefer it be them. And so you see these areas for coalition building, consensus, more issue-based conversations and debate. Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, for example, was recently asked what she thought of ranked choice voting. And she said, when I knew I needed to get a voter's second place ranking, I'm not just going to trash talk her in our debates or public encounters because I want to pick up some of that support too. So we saw a level of civility in many cases. I think what we demonstrated in Alaska was the possibility that electoral reform can happen and it can deliver outcomes that are less partisan and perhaps less politically rancorous, right? And it just makes sense. You don't want to alienate someone who you're actually trying to pick up support from them on second choices or third choices. So you look for common ground. Also improves representation, especially racial representation, ethnic representation by gender. Here are some of the data points that we have. Voters of color tend to use more rankings. Ranked choice voting in the primary ended up with New York City having the most diverse city council in its history. Over the last decade, women have won half of municipal races. And we see from the data that candidates of color tend to gain more votes in the round-by-round counting process, which shows more consensus building, coalition building, rather than voters potentially splitting the vote. Finally, just saving money. It's always nice, right? If you have a runoff and you go to instant runoff voting, you don't have a second election that you have to pay for. You're not having to put up all of the infrastructure of a whole other election. It just happens on one day, right? And some jurisdictions have actually used this to essentially get rid of primaries as well and say, look, the primaries are serving a winnowing purpose already. Let's just have everybody on the ballot and people can rank. So that is one usage as well that can help save money. So that is sort of where we have been. And I want to talk next about the second part of it, which is the future or the road ahead. So first is presidential primaries. Then we'll talk about Final Four, Final Five. This is known as the Alaska system. They were the first to use that. And then talk about proportional ranked choice voting, which from FairVote's perspective is kind of the gold standard of what would do the most for our country. So presidential primaries. They're kind of the perfect place to use ranked choice voting because you have these huge fields, right? You have 12 people crammed on a debate stage, and you have this person getting 3% of the vote, that person getting 5, this person getting 10, 12, right? And what comes out of that is just you can't really be confident that whoever becomes the standard bearer for that party is the consensus choice of that party, will represent the party well in the general election, and will represent the broadest swath of Americans possible. So, and it's also high profile, so people really do develop pretty, they can rank 10 candidates in a row and say, I know them, right? I've watched the debates. So RCV in this context can be particularly helpful. The other reason it can be helpful here is the kind of strange structure of how primaries play out over time. So if I vote for a candidate through early voting and they drop out before election day, that's tough, right? My vote doesn't end up counting for anyone. Maybe I would have had a say on the other candidates. Who knows? And this is definitely not a hypothetical. So in 2020, on the Democratic side, over 3 million votes, more than 8% of the Democratic electorate, cast ballots for folks who dropped out of the race. And so those votes just didn't end up counting. And it happens on the Republican side as well. So in 2016, almost 2 million votes, more than 5% of the GOP electorate in 2016. So by having rankings, if someone drops out, you just take them out of the tabulation, you go to the next choice. If that person dropped out, you go to the next choice, right? That ballot ends up counting. That person still gets a say. So presidential primaries can be particularly helpful. Using RCV in presidential primaries can be particularly helpful. This was already used actually by some of the party-run states, Wyoming, Alaska, Kansas, Hawaii. The Democratic Party used ranked choice voting in 2020. Nevada did like a hybrid thing, so they had caucuses, but if you couldn't attend the caucuses, you could cast a ranked ballot instead. Both parties will be using it in Maine. It's a state-run primary, so this will be the first state-run presidential primary using ranked choice voting. And we expect that the calendar's still kind of unfolding and coming together, but we actually expect that about the same or more jurisdictions will end up using ranked choice voting in the presidential primaries context for 2024. And hopefully, I think we see more going forward. So, Final 4/5 voting. So Alaska adopted what's known as the top 4 system. So Final 4, other folks are aiming for Final 5. Just to kind of break this apart, because sometimes they are conflated and Final 5 is just viewed as ranked choice voting. A Final 5 or Final 4 system is kind of 2 different reforms packaged together. It's a little turducken-ish kind of reform. So the first is unified partisan primary, where all the candidates can run. Doesn't matter what your party is or if you're unaffiliated, you're running in a combined primary. All the voters participate in that primary. So doesn't matter if you're Republican, Democrat, unaffiliated, you're voting in that round. And it's a pick one primary. So it is single choice voting for that primary. The top 4 or 5, depending on how it's structured, candidates go from that into the general election. The general election is then decided through a ranked choice voting ballot. So it's these 2 combination of reforms that create the Final 4, Final 5 system. Some of the benefits, I mean, ranked choice voting, we think helps in, frankly, any election that has more than 2 candidates. So if you've got 4, you've got 5, seems like a good way to do that. Also, having that used in the general election means you're really getting more voters at the highest turnout point when most people can have an impact. There are some critiques of this system. So one critique is from a party perspective, sometimes party insiders or political scientists who have a stronger view of the role of parties will say, look, we should be protecting the party's ability to make their choice of who they want without other unaffiliated voters or even voters from the other side having any potential impact on that, right? So in terms of this critique, I do want to like tease that apart from RCV, because we sometimes hear, I don't like RCV because we think that the parties should be able to pick their person. And so I want to back up and say, you can still do that, right? So in Virginia, for example, the Virginia Republicans used ranked choice voting for their closed primary in Virginia, right? It was a party-run process. Similarly, in Maine, those are still party primaries. They use ranked choice voting in the party primary. They use ranked choice voting in the general. So if you have a concern about the party piece of it, the party control piece of it, that's kind of unique to this system. Some of the benefits of this system, though, are what the campaigners focus on, which is actually kind of the opposite of that, right? Getting an independence from party control, really wanting to have the full voice of the electorate expressed in that first round to determine who's going on into the general election so that everybody kind of gets to vote on everyone. So that's the selling point of the Alaska system. And Alaska used this for the first time in 2022. They'll be using it again in 2024. So they'll be, I believe, no, they won't be joining for the primary because they have a state run, but they will be using ranked choice voting in the general election for president as well. All right, on to the real nitty-gritty technical stuff, proportional ranked choice voting. So we started talking about single winner, mayor, governor, that kind of race. I want to talk about what I see as the future, what ranked choice voting, what FairVote sees as the future, which is proportional ranked choice voting. And this is for electing multiple members, multiple seats at once. For Congress, this is the Fair Representation Act, which has been introduced a few times in a row. And so I want to unpack that and then talk about how this can apply at the state and local level as well. So for Congress, I mean, I think some of the things we talked about at the top, this applies, and we see this in Congress as well, which is 80% of all US House districts are essentially predetermined, right? We know a Democrat's going to win in this seat. We know a Republican's going to win in this other seat, whether that's because of gerrymandering or just kind of geography and self-sorting, right? Both of these play into this, but it leads to a lot of uncompetitive seats. In 2022, 120 candidates for the House won with a plurality, so did not win with a majority. 69 of those candidates won with less than 40% support, and 32 won with support with from less than 1/3 in their own party in the primary. So you're talking about people elected to Congress with sort of a fraction of a fraction of their electorate support. And I think we kind of intuitively know that the congressional delegations we see aren't really reflecting those states, right? So Illinois is not 14-3 blue, right? Florida's not 20-8 red. Massachusetts isn't literally 100% Democrats, and Oklahoma is not 100% Republicans. But that's the congressional delegations that we get, right? And also, I mean, as a lawyer, I'm okay with legal fees on redistricting and election-related things. That's okay. But I don't think the taxpayers like it. And I think they're right? Which is, there is a ton of money that goes into the redistricting process, a ton of money and time that goes into litigating these. There are a bunch of maps that are still being battled out in the courts. We'll see a lot of changes as we go into 2024 and 2026. So the Fair Representation Act intervenes here with 3 different points. One is switching from single-member congressional districts to multi-member congressional districts. 2 is proportional RCV. And 3 is independent redistricting commissions to draw the lines. I won't talk a lot about the independent commissions point because that's kind of its own reform that I think folks are probably familiar with. The main focus of the Fair Representation Act here is on multi-member districts and on proportional representation. So what are some of the benefits of having multiple seats elected from one district rather than a single member for each district? One is it reduces the impact of gerrymandering. I mean, if you look at the map on the left and the right, the lines just can't do as much work, right? If you only get to draw a few lines rather than a bunch of lines, you can only slice and dice so much. So when you have multi-member districts, the impact of gerrymandering is greatly reduced. It also allows multi-party and multiracial representation within each district, which we'll talk about a little bit more. It allows more for competitive elections because it gets rid of safe seats, more swing districts, more seats at play. And it makes space potentially for congresspeople even outside of the 2-party system. And I think there's 2 ways to look at this. One is you could have a 3rd party, a 4-party electing some members to Congress, or frankly, you could just have more diversity within each of the 2 parties, right? You could welcome back sort of the Northeastern Republicans and welcome back the Blue Dog Democrats from the South into those parties and broaden the tent of those parties. And it creates incentives for legislators to collaborate when they have a shared constituency. A key point here, though, is that the multi-member districts piece can't stand apart from the proportional representation or the proportional RCV part. Multi-member districts have a very bad history in the United States of being used for suppressive purposes because it essentially could allow for the majority coalition in that district to sweep all the seats. So what you do is you pair this with proportional representation and you get much better results. So proportional ranked choice voting represents voter groups in proportion to their share of the seats. I think in some ways, a lot of voters think this is what our system either already does or should do, which is that if somebody gets 40% of the vote, if some group gets 40% of the vote, they should get 40% of the seats. If they get 60% of the vote, they should get 60% of the seats. It doesn't and can't work out that way with single member districting, but there is something sort of intuitive and fair about that. So this, again, in proportion to their vote share. Again, provides voter choice because you get to rank your candidates. Also improves representation for women and people of color, similar to single winner. And it promotes proportionality across any dimension that the voter's voting on, right? It's kind of a self-defined list depending on how you rank. So can provide proportionality in terms of party representation, in terms of race, ethnicity. If there are defining issues in your multi-member district, people will be voting on those issues. That'll be one of the ways that you see proportionality show up. And it eliminates the trade-offs between the values that you see in redistricting. So there are a lot of different values that you can pursue when you're redistricting, and the map makers end up having this kind of top-down control to choose which of those values should be advanced, right? Whether that's equal opportunity, racial and ethnic representation, whether it's partisan proportionality, whether it's competitive seats, whether it's compact districts that don't sort of like string out all over the place, or whether it's like, not breaking up cities and counties into multiple different districts. Whoever is drawing the map with a single member district has to make a decision about what they're going to prioritize over something else. But if you combine multi-member districts and proportional ranked choice voting, you don't. So for example, here's Texas. This is their current congressional map on the left. And this is, getting wonky, kind of a radar graph comparing the different elements of the map, right? So we can see it's pretty good on minority representation. It's pretty good on sort of rough proportionality with vote share, 64%. Maybe pretty good isn't good if it's a failing grade, I don't know. Minorities is a C+, so never mind. But still, compared to 6 on competitiveness, right? There's like very little competitiveness in this Texas map, almost none whatsoever. Compactness, these are not compact districts. I think you can kind of look at a lot of these, say District 15, that orange one stringing up from the bottom, right? Not compact districts, and lots of splitting. So a 13 score on in terms of splitting counties and cities. Compare that to a sample map with the Fair Representation Act. So what we have here is a few different 5-member districts and one 3-member district off to the left. And we have a grading on these various different parameters. And the point is you don't have to trade them off. They're all possible at the same time, right? Your districts can be compact. They can adhere to county and city lines. They can provide equal opportunity for ethnic and racial minorities. They can provide competition. They can provide proportionality, all of it at once. The trade-off is inherent only in the single-member district piece. So once you get rid of that, this is possible. And this is the kind of thing, I know Dave Daly spoke here recently, where he said, once you see this possibility, you kind of can't unsee it. You're like, why are we putting ourselves in this box where we have to choose between all these different things that people like and want to see out of their maps and out of their representatives? You don't have to choose, right? So it is definitely sort of, I think, the leading edge, the future of where we'd like to see things go. And I think that in an earlier era, when we first started talking about this was a laugh you out of the room kind of discussion. And now it is but tell me a little bit more kind of discussion. So people aren't necessarily 100% on board immediately, but I think people are starting to realize that this solves so many of the problems that we all struggle with and see. So how does it work? As before, voters can rank candidates. All candidates who cross what's called the election threshold earn a seat. The more seats you have in a district, the lower the threshold, the more proportional the results. So I'm going to skip through these to show this. So here are the election thresholds. This, again, is getting to the wonky side. But if you think about electing one seat, that person has to cross a threshold of 50% plus 1. Why? Because nobody else can also win 50% plus 1, right? Doesn't work. And the same holds depending on how many seats you're electing. If it's 2 seats, you have to cross 33% plus 1. If it's 3 seats, 25% plus 1, right? It's the similar logic as single winner, but simply because you can't have 4 people all win 25% plus 1 of the vote. There just won't be that many votes, right? So that's why you pick these thresholds. And as you can see, as the threshold gets lower, so in a 5-member district, any constituency that represents at least 16.7% of the vote, they'll have a voice, they'll have a seat, right? You don't have to split everyone up into majorities within their own single-member districts. People can kind of decide what they're voting on, what values they would like to see advanced, and that naturally flows through depending on what constituencies meet this threshold. To make this happen, you have to do one tweak to the tabulation thing we talked about before, which is you not only are transferring votes from eliminated candidates, you also transfer votes from elected candidates who got way more of the vote than they needed. Why do you do this? It's essentially to make the most of everyone's vote. So if you think about your vote like a dollar, if your first choice, if it takes your whole dollar to get your choice in office, your whole vote goes to that person. If it only took 50 cents to get your first choice elected, only 50 cents goes to that person, the other 50 cents goes to your second choice. And the reason you do that is it's the way that it creates proportional representation. Because if you don't do that, you could end up with results where a minority of voters, again, can elect a majority of seats and other weird outcomes. So, for example, here you have, Rust has 25% of the vote, they've got a seat. Plum got 35% of the vote, they get a seat, but they got more votes than they needed, right? So we don't want to kind of unnecessarily waste the votes of people who voted for Plum. It needs to be proportional. So we actually distribute the surplus, and we look to their second choices and say, okay, a little bit goes to lavender. Violet was a favorite among this group, right? So now we've got these three below the win threshold. Now we eliminate lavender because they're the lowest, and that pushes violet up above the top. So you filled 3 seats. You have proportionality in terms of the vote share of the purple party and the orange party in this situation, 2 to 1. So it's more complicated, right? Because you have to distribute the extra votes plus the eliminated votes. But this is what gives you proportional outcomes. No more single party states and fair representation across multiple dimensions. So if we look at, say, Alabama, for example, the current congressional map, if folks have been following the Supreme Court, the Allen versus Milligan case, a whole lot of litigation over whether there should be 1 seat or 2 seats, black opportunity districts. There was 1 seat in the initial map. Finally, through all of this, litigation looks like there should be 2. The state has redrawn the maps in a way that we don't know if we'll see that play out in time. So there's kind of this back and forth, this elaborate fight over the lines. But if you actually just reduce the number of districts and used proportional ranked choice voting, you naturally end up with 2 seats because that's proportional, right? That's just how that plays out. Similarly, for party representation in Florida, if you look at the current map, how it compares to statewide partisanship levels, it doesn't really line up, right? But if you use multi-member districts and proportional representation, that kind of matches, right? You see roughly equivalent share for Republican and Democratic voters, and there's 2 kind of toss-up seats in the middle there. This leads to more competitive elections overall. So right now, in the current system, over 80% of districts, again, we said are safe seats. In the FRA, basically every district has some competitive level of seats there. And a majority of the districts would contain a true toss-up seat, so not even like a lean Republican or lean Democrat, a true competitive seat in a majority of districts. So here, for example, is Louisiana, comparison between current single member and how this might look if you had multi-member, right? Up here, you've got 1 blue, 2 red in that district. Down here, it's 1 blue, 1 red, 1 lean red. And that ends up kind of mirroring Louisiana. Proportional ranked choice voting, also provides for fairer, more robust racial and ethnic representation in a structural kind of way that isn't so dependent on particular line drawing decisions. So here, for example, are some studies. Moon Duchin's group, MGGG, ran a bunch of simulations of what you could potentially see under multi-member districts with proportional representation for Congress. In Illinois, if you look at the red line, which is indicative of current candidates of color who are elected, it's right about 6. But if you had PRCV and multi-member districts, you would actually expect that to be somewhere between 9 and 10 elected officials of color. Similarly, in Texas, right now it's about 12 under the current map where the red line is. We would actually naturally, with proportional, expect that to be closer to about 18 or 19 representatives. And similar things for Maryland, right? This is Democratic and Republican. 2 persons of color representing elected in Maryland, that should be 5 based on the proportionality of that state, and it's what you would most likely see in a map out of Maryland. And again, that's without sort of intentional, specific drawing of district lines. It just naturally arises from using a proportional system. And finally, no more voters locked out of representation. So folks who actually can cast an effective ballot wherever they live, in any district, in any state in the United States. Very briefly before we end, this isn't necessarily just a congressional project. So in the past, New York City actually used this kind of system for the city council from 1936 to 1947. Led to more accurate representation. Democrats previously had massive supermajorities and just completely controlled. This is kind of Tammany Hall situation. So they were pulled down to about 50 to 66, depending on the election, % control, which was roughly in share with the amount of Democratic voters in New York City. And you saw a lot more political diversity, right? So you saw Republicans winning council seats, American Labor Party, Insurgent Democrat, Liberal, some communists, which may help explain why this ended up getting repealed. It did elect some communists, right? Independents being elected. And similarly, you saw the first black council member elected, Adam Clayton Powell. You saw the first woman council member elected, Genevieve Earle. Again, in 1936 to 1947, this might not have actually helped the case. But in this day and age, I think we can see that that actually is a benefit, right? That is something we should be aspiring to have proportional representation. Cambridge actually adopted it in 1941 and kept it. So they still use this. They elect 9 seats, all at large. 95% of voters end up seeing one of their top 3 elected. 94% of voters using multiple candidates, ranking multiple candidates. And one of the things that's interesting here that you hear as a pushback against multi-member districts is, I like that there's geographic diversity, right? When you have single-member districts, everyone has some geographic stake, right? Some geographic interest represented. One of the things you can see is that neighborhood representation actually naturally arises because it is yet another one of the interest areas that people in the same geographic area share in common, right? They relate to issues that are pertinent to their area. And so you end up with geographic distribution throughout Cambridge. It's not all centered in one place, even though it's elected entirely at large. And there is still sort of other jurisdictions on the horizon. So Portland, Oregon adopted this with 57% support in 2022. First use will be in 2024. They're doing 4 districts, each electing 3 members. Again, using proportional ranked choice voting. Their campaign focused on racial justice and inclusion because the use of single-member districts just essentially locked out minority voters in Portland. So that was a big theme of the adoption in Portland. And technically, there isn't necessarily a bar to this in several states if they wanted to do it for state legislatures. So 9 state legislatures actually already have multi-member districts. They just don't use proportional representation, proportional ranked choice voting. And others could adopt it through legislation because there isn't any state constitutional constraint on their ability to do so. So that is a whole lot. But I'll now sit down for a conversation and hopefully we can have an opportunity to chat further and talk through some questions. Thank you.
So let's see. So before we open it up to the audience, I'm going to take an unusually adversarial tone. And I know that we have welcomed you to talk about this great reform and these ideas that are percolating around the country. But I'm going to ask you some hypotheticals and some contrary questions just to see what happens. So I'm sitting here thinking I'd like reform that makes democracy more responsive. That sounds like a pretty good idea. But I think I'd like to have my own legislator. I want my own Congress critter. I want someone who reports to me. I want to go visit them, I want to be their constituent. So I'm not entirely convinced. It strikes me that this multi-member thing, which is sort of this far horizon of reform, it strikes me as losing some of that. And there are countries that have achieved more proportional representation without having individual member districts. And so why should we want this multi-member approach as opposed to, say, Germany, which has districts and then a mechanism to make sure that it's proportional? Mexico has the same thing. So what is it about multi-member of this particular flavor that should make us want it here in the United States?
Sure.
I'll do my...
I wonder if we could turn it. I think these...
The microphones are on, and yeah, the microphones are on, so...
turned up for people?
Yeah, let's continue. Go ahead.
Okay. So, I mean, a couple things. One, also, I appreciate the adversarial nature of conversation is coming into this as a lawyer. I feel like
As a,
the fun part of this. So.
as a friend.
As a friend, yeah. So in terms of having sort of a specific geography covered, I think there's a few responses to that. One is that I think that's a fully legitimate position, right? I think people can really value geographic representation. What I would say is, one, I think that actually that would most likely naturally arise in a 3 or 5 member district. You would see different geographic representation.
As in Cambridge.
As in Cambridge. And secondly, that we don't necessarily get good geographic representation with single member districts, right? I think that's true if we're really prioritizing county and city lines and compactness, but again, that involves a trade-off, right? That might harm equal opportunity for minority representation, it might harm competitive districts to do that. So those are some of the kind of trade-offs that we're forced into. And I do think there's apart from the geography side, the idea of just this person represents me, I know who to call, right? I think that can still be something that is valued even if it's, your district kind of weaves throughout the state. But I think that there are other additional values here that we can see, which is when I used to work for Congressman Chris Van Hollen, now senator, and one of the interesting things is we would occasionally get calls not from our district because the voter felt like we better represented them. We see this a lot actually in practice, again, with racial and ethnic minority representation, which is if you're a black voter and you feel like your elected representative actually doesn't hear you and doesn't reflect you, you often see that black members who are elected in states will get calls from outside their district because that's actually what that person wants to talk about. That's the person who kind of understands them. And so if you're in a 3-member district, you may say, I've got the person I go to, right? This of the 3 people, this is the person who's my person, and I feel like they really hear me and they're gonna carry my interests into the halls of Congress. I don't know about this other person, these other 2 people, right?
Well, I think that this speaks to a question of why we want reform. I will speak candidly and say that there are a lot of well-meaning people who are, really committed, and well-meaning is sort of a bad phrase to use, but people who are really committed to change, but they don't always have, they have a clear intuition that a change is probably going to be good, but it's not always clear why. And so you're touching on a particular point, which is not representation. So there's the question about whether the majority is represented by a majority of representatives. There's a question of whether a particular interest group or racial group has a seat at the table. So that's one kind of representation. But now you're talking about a broad category called constituent service. So in the same broad category of what you just talked about is prison gerrymandering. Prison gerrymandering, surprisingly, when one does the calculations, doesn't change representation that much. And so the reason to care about it is not number of representatives, but it's rather that those people who are incarcerated need someone to speak for them. And if they are placed in a district where they can't vote, then their representative doesn't actually have a motivation to represent them. But if they're placed in their home district where they reside, then they and their families have a voice through their representative. And so I just want to cast a vote for understanding why we're doing these reforms. Before opening it up, I wanted to touch on another topic, which is practicalities. How to get these reforms, and I just wanted to run through a couple of things. One thing, and this is going to sound a little tetchy, but I have an easy time understanding the current rule. I go in there, I mark one person, get my choice. Okay, now I have to rank a few people, so I think I can probably put up with that. So I think I can do that. Okay, then you say, okay, now actually, what you do is you make one ranking, and now we're going to use a computational rule where if half the votes go to one person, then they get that candidate elected, then another third get the votes, then we'll assign that, and we shouldn't have too many wasted votes. How important is it for a rule to be intuitive for people to understand, and how much should we tell people about that rule?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, what I would say is it's maybe a little bit of like a choose your own adventure response, which is, I think for some people, it doesn't, I don't need to know the tabulation rules, right? And I think in some ways, if you think about our current election systems, a lot of people know they go, they vote, send it in, maybe this is one of the things we're actually seeing a problem with our current election system is that there's not a lot of sort of deep knowledge around how it actually works. But they just know that once you've cast your vote, it's going to translate, right? So for some folks, it may be, look, I know that I get to rank my preferences top to bottom, and the folks who agree with me, if it's 40% of the vote, I get 40% of the seats. That's a system I like. That's a system I want. I don't like the system we have. Done. For other folks, the next question is how, right? Like, how does it do that? What are you doing when you do that? And I think all of those are appropriate, right? I don't think it's necessarily wrong that someone doesn't care about the tabulation, whether it's single winner or multi-winner, if they care about what it is achieving, the goods that it's providing. But a lot of people have questions, and it's important to have answer those questions and be incredibly transparent. And so voter education campaigns are a huge piece of the adoption puzzle here.
Certain kinds of education are essential. So for instance, if were we to adopt a ranked choice system in any election, people should exercise the power of their vote. And if you go in there and just cast one vote for your top candidate, you've not used the full power of your vote. And so certain kinds of voter education seem to me to be pretty crucial, especially for reaching segments of the population that may not know a whole lot about voting rules. And if they have the task of, or they're busy. I mean, you got to get to daycare. You got to go get to work on time. Right. Whatever it is you got to do. There's life to live. And so one component that seems to be essential is making sure that people at least know what they have to do to be heard.
And I do think that in Cambridge, for example, was a lesson in this. That was a multi-year campaign to really just get into communities, build coalition, talk about this group to group to group. There was a ton of voter education and coalition building that went into that, and then people realized, yeah, this does have all the benefits we want to see. So
and you can see that in real time. Like if you look in the Maine congressional election, Bruce Poliquin, in the first time that it was run in his congressional district, Mr. Poliquin is a Republican. The first time he said, "Only vote for me. Don't make a second or third choice." Right. The second time he started allowing the possibility of making a second choice. In Alaska, in the 2022 election, there were two ranked choice elections in a row in August and November for reasons having to do with the passing of Representative Don Young. The first time, Sarah Palin said, "Vote for me, don't make a second choice." And but 3 months later, by November, she was campaigning with an opponent, or she was at an appearance with Mary Peltola saying, "Oh, you should make sure to rank me second. If you don't like her, gosh, you should pick me." And so she made sorry about that. She made certain to start using that rule. So that's interesting to see someone who's in some ways a real renegade in the American political system actually making use of it. Before we open it up, I wanted to ask a practical question, and it's just a general category of how to get there. So we've talked a lot about should it be done, and you've made a pretty strong case, I think, for whether these reforms should be implemented. And I want to ask the question of, can it be done? How do you persuade a legislator that it's in his or her interest? What's the path to actually getting one of these things to be implemented? I'm a little mystified by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's overgeneralizing, but kind of two buckets. One is what I would say is the outside track, which is ballot initiatives, right? Like the kind of thing where there's actually popular momentum that it doesn't matter if the legislators want it or not. The people have the ability to say, we're going to circulate a petition, we're going to get this on the ballot, we're going to run a campaign, and a majority of people are going to vote for it, and that's the rule, right? So that's the outside.
In half the states, you can have an initiative, and in those half of the states, right, you just force it on them. You just give it to them good and hard. Okay.
So, right. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's that's one way of putting it. The inside track would be, I think, on the local side, a little bit easier if you're talking about council members, things like that, where a lot of these are nonpartisan races, and so there isn't quite the same partisan valence, and it's more in the nature of, you've got these close connections. Bob at the grocery store, that person's your council member, right? So you can have a little bit more direct connection to be like, look, Bob, isn't this better, right? And you can have that conversation and not have it be filtered so heavily through the partisan lens. I think it is more difficult for state legislative level reforms, congressional reforms, where kind of everything goes through this lens of like, will it harm or hurt me? Will it harm or hurt my party in this particular jurisdiction? which, if we're talking about Massachusetts, 100% blue delegation. If you're talking about introducing a system that's going to elect some Republicans in Massachusetts, that means a Democrat's going to lose their seat, right? And vice versa. And so
I'm not immediately feeling the power structure in Massachusetts wanting that.
so, I mean, one, I think, is this question of having to build a constituency that sees the broader value, not just be on a seat-by-seat basis. And so that can be, the need for Democratic representation in states where there currently isn't Democratic representation, or vice versa, right? And coalition building.
Yeah.
And this is one reason why on the congressional level, there's often some discussion around, well, look, if you're going to do this reform, should it be paired with something we were talking about earlier, which is the concept of increasing the size of the House, which again is another sort of like long shot discussion, but does very practically help address this question of, look, all of the legislators in Oklahoma and in Massachusetts, you may well get to keep your seats because there will be more seats to be had, right?
From a purely strategic point of view, I would just not do this for congressional seats, because the moment you said, oh, the Massachusetts delegation would no longer be all Democratic, or the Utah delegation or whatever state it might be would not be all Republican. Like, just my spider sense is just like flashing really brightly that no partisan leader is going to go for that. On the other hand, you can imagine that a special case would be in a highly partisan state for legislative races than one can imagine, right? So in a legislature that is safely Democratic or safely Republican, no matter what, you can imagine starting to appeal to people's self-interest. It's good government, and it doesn't change who's going to be in control. And although you said that there's more competition, some of those seats are going to be safe. And you get yourself listed on the ballot, so you're the safe one. And so you get the leaders to be, I'm sorry, just being fairly calculating here, and you figure out a way to make sure that the leaders who are going to benefit from it, they find a way to get themselves onto the ballot. So you have, kind of long-term career legislators, and so some seats are still going to be safe, and ballot placement. So I'm just thinking about ways to get a legislator to want this, as opposed to saying, well, you should want it because it's better.
Right.
I'm like, okay, to paraphrase my colleague Peter Singer, everyone would be better off if I gave 80% of my income to charity. I actually do not have currently plans to do that.
Yeah. So I mean, a few responses on the state level. I do think there's a couple different political calculations here. One of which is the safe seats concept is a little bit different in this structure, which is the most popular Democrat will be safe, right? The most popular Republican in that district will be safe in the sense that most people support them, so they'll cross the threshold first, they'll get elected, right? It isn't a safe seat in the sense that like this particular person, the leader or the person who holds the inside track will get elected. I think one of the advantages here is that I think a lot of politicians think they are the most popular one, right? So they say, I'm going to be the one who's going to be elected, right? Or the most popular leaders are the ones who end up having a lot of power in the party because they're the most popular. They control their own constituencies, they have their own voice, especially nowadays with social media. They sort of move the party. So I think that you see the most popular leaders would have that self-interest and be able to see my interests aren't going to be harmed here. At a more macro level, I do think that, if you're thinking through sort of like the gamesmanship of how do you get someone who's looking out for their own skin to buy into this, it doesn't necessarily get them across the threshold to say it's just better for everyone, right? And there, I think, is you have to pay attention to like what are the key issue areas that people feel like they can't back down on because that's important to the party, as well as, do they feel like the electoral tides are shifting in a way where actually having more dependable proportional representation is in their interest in the long term because they actually see that maybe single member districting is going to hurt them as time continues to unfold, right? Where they say, I don't think I can keep winning this game over and over again playing the gerrymandering game, right? So let's get rid of the gerrymandering game. I feel like I can win on the merits, on the issues. I can win voters, but I can't win this redistricting game. And when you have that kind of situation, then it's appealing to the party because that's kind of their way to actually hold on to power. as they're sort of on the way out, is to say, look, we think that a majority of voters are going to keep sending us a majority, but only if we get rid of this whole redistricting fight, which we feel like we might lose. Because the redistricting is kind of like how you control your ability to preserve your majority in the absence of something like this.
As a candidate in a multi-seat district, do I have to spend, if I have 3 seats in that district, do I have to spend 3 times as much money?
So I don't think it would be 3 times as much money. There is a question as to whether it would be more money in the sense that your district is larger, right? Like a statewide Senate race costs more than, well, not always. Depends on the importance of the congressional seat, right? Often costs more than a single member congressional seat. So I think there could be some degree of like increased spending for any given member. But I think there's other things that kind of unfold in this space that could potentially impact that as well, which is if you look at countries that have a long-standing history of using this system, the party actually does a lot more work in terms of like figuring out how we're going to mobilize, telling people these are the rankings you should do. So in some ways, rather than having sort of the, what's the word, like maverick by maverick by maverick individual legislators, the party can fill more of a role and say, look, this is our lead person. We think you should rank them first, this person second, third, whatever. This we think is going to give us the best odds of getting the most seats. And so in some ways, the party can help take a little bit of the emphasis off of that.
That's interesting because political scientists do have concerns about excessive weakening of parties where it sounds like a good idea to weaken political parties because one always likes to weaken powerful entities, but at least naively. But that turns out to lead to a certain kind of incoherence and hollowing out of parties. The other thing is that certain expenses don't scale. So if you, for instance, take out an advertisement,
That's a good point.
A district that's 3 times as large doesn't necessarily cost 3 times as much. So I think there are factors that go in either direction.
What other countries are using ranked choice voting that have a long history of it, and does that tell us something?
Yeah, so, and actually, I appreciate this because it gets back to a question I realized I didn't answer. So one of the houses in Australia uses proportional ranked choice voting, also referred to as the single transferable vote. So sometimes it's called STV. Abroad, it typically is. Ireland uses it as well. I'm trying to remember, there are a couple others, largely prior Commonwealth countries. And so I want to raise that because I think it's actually quite relevant to why do we think this can succeed here, why this versus something else, which is there's kind of this inherited sense around like how elections should play out, as well as a certain commitment to a lot of candidate focus. A lot of later proportional representation systems are very party focused, like you have what's called closed list proportional representation, where the party is really deciding, depending on how many votes we get for our party, these are the people that will be elected, and the voters don't actually necessarily have a say in who those people are. The party just controls that, right? The history in the United States is much more one of a candidate-centered kind of reform atmosphere, and we see this through the progressive era and et cetera, which is this real focus on lifting up individual candidates and the merits of individual candidates. And so, one of the reasons why I think proportional ranked choice voting is helpful in the American context is that it resonates with that kind of concept, which is I may not want to cast a vote for X party and just trust that that's going to go to the right person, right? I might want to say this candidate for this party, and actually my second choice is this moderate from the other party who I think is closer to where I am.
This does speak to a very particular point, which is that when reforms arise, they speak to the needs that emerged during that time. And so in the first Gilded Age and the first progressive era, we ended up with popularly elected United States senators. Women gained the right to vote, and those spoke to needs that were apparent at the time. And so one thing about ranked choice voting is that because one of the central diseases of the last 3 decades is polarization and people falling down along a single dimension of partisanship from liberal to conservative, then that creates a perception of a need. The parties as teams, and therefore the identity of individual candidates doesn't mean quite as much. And it becomes more important how many members you have on your team. And your membership in party becomes actually fairly important. And so now that I think about it, this particular reform is fairly matched to the thing that we have right now, which of course raises the question about whether it'll be a good reform if we have some happy future when we have less partisan polarization. So I'm just thinking about ranked choice voting as a specific solution to a problem that is afflicting us today in 2023. Eric.
We talk a lot about polarization, but I'm also hearing that there are a lot more independent voters now than there used to be. And I'm just wondering if you have a sense that independent voters would be more amenable to ranked choice voting?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see a lot of support, especially among independent and unaffiliated voters, for this top 4, final 5 kind of system, which, you know, when you have closed primaries, those folks don't get to influence the primaries. They just show up on the general election day, and that's the only time they have to have a say. And so I think among unaffiliated voters, there is more interest in this because you kind of have more of a say in who the finalists are and which of those finalists you get to pick. I mean, I do think the political science on this is a little bit, shows that a lot of the times the folks who are saying, I'm independent, actually have a pretty strong partisan preference. They just don't really like being aligned with the party, which I think kind of says its own thing too.
And they don't have the ability to vote in a primary.
Right.
So returning to a reform that's live and on the docket this year, top 4 and top 5, enable the 1/3 of voters who are nominally unaffiliated with either party, and it gives them a voice. And so I think a reform that's quite big this year in Nevada, there was an attempt to do so in Idaho and other states. That's a reform this year that could build confidence by including people who say they're unaffiliated. Okay, maybe, yeah, 1 or 2 more questions here in the center.
Oh, it's okay.
First, just thank you for a very interesting and engaging talk. I promised myself I wasn't going to ask this, but since you mentioned the Commonwealth countries, I just have to ask, just 'cause my background is in British political history. So why? I know, you know, Britain had a referendum. The UK had a referendum on essentially ranked choice voting in 2011, and they over 67%, I think, voted no. So I was just wondering, it's kind of a more academic-y question, but why do you think it's been popular kind of in the former Commonwealth countries, as you showed, in many states here, but not in kind of, you know, Britain herself?
I wish I had a really good answer for you. I'm not sure. I mean, I do think that, like a lot of the reform efforts here, there's a lot of energy to the status quo. Maybe if you're in the longest lineage of that status quo, you feel like you're more connected to it. That is a very not academic answer to a very good academic question. But if anyone else has a good inkling as to the support in the UK, I do know we have friends over there who are continuing to fight the good fight, as well as in Canada, trying to push for ranked choice voting and proportional ranked choice voting. And I think it's just, you know, it's a journey. It's a long road, and you know, I don't think Congress is going to be passing the Fair Representation Act this session or next session, right? But I think it's about having Portlands, having use of ranked ballots generally across various different jurisdictions, and slowly kind of building familiarity. So you kind of have to get that first foot in the door and keep getting the foot in the door to the point where everyone starts to view it as not some crazy outlandish thing, but, oh, this is perfectly reasonable. Tons of people are doing it. Why aren't I? So maybe it's just a matter of kind of getting the foot in the door more. So best of luck to friends in the UK.
Eric, you have the pleasure of picking the last question.
Hey, Michael, thanks for coming out. There's a line from The Godfather that the Godfather's shooting was business, not personal. So I'm going to ask you a question that's going to maybe seem personal, but it's actually business. The Congress person that you worked for, what party affiliation were they?
Democrat.
Or a Democrat. Yep. Do you consider yourself a Democrat?
I do. I think right now. I mean, I'm registered Democrat right now. Okay. I've voted for different members of different parties sort of across time, but
okay. Have you ever voted for a Republican presidential candidate?
Presidential candidate, no.
Okay, thank you.
I should say that it is possible to be a member of a party and yet want good nonpartisan reform. But because of questions like this, I not registered to a party, and I've personally voted in primaries of either political party. But certainly this is a natural thing that comes up, which does bring up, actually, I will ask one last question, which is the forces of politics are really focused within the parties, which have huge amounts of material resources. So just curious about your general sense of what it's like to work in a space where one cannot count on major party support, where you have to constantly be making a case based on horrible things like logic and citizen initiatives and donations. Like, just give a sense for the challenges of that.
Yeah, and actually I do want to your point, maybe indicate one thing, which is in the past I've actually typically been unaffiliated and I've just voted in the general, or when I lived in a jurisdiction where you can walk up and pick, I would walk up and pick. And sometimes you didn't necessarily have to just pick on the whole. I currently live in Pennsylvania where that's not an option, right? I have, if I want to participate in the primary at all, I have to make a choice.
Right, this is a challenge of politics that if you're in an uncompetitive district, you get on the train or the train leaves without you.
Right, or you just show up in the general and the choice has been made for you. So, you know, if that weren't the case, I probably would just go back to being unaffiliated because I am more comfortable just personally kind of in that space because it resonates with me. And my general election voting patterns have kind of been all over the map. In terms of the nonpartisan election reform space, kind of good government reforms, you know, all I can say is that it is a challenge insofar as like most of the resources you see, especially say in redistricting fights, right? They're coming from folks who have an interest in the outcome, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, the funneling towards the campaigns regarding it, the legal battles regarding it. So it is not necessarily a well-funded space to be saying, look, we think here this will benefit Republicans and here this will benefit Democrats because it's all about building coalitions, and in this jurisdiction, this seems like the biggest coalition, in this jurisdiction, this seems like the biggest coalition, right? So you can't necessarily say it's going to advantage one group or another. And relatedly, I do want to say one thing that sometimes people attack our CV for is they'll say, well, I think it elects extremists. And then another group will say, well, I think it elects bland, boring moderates. And so it's been attacked from both of those sides. And my answer to that is it's neither, right? It elects the broadest coalition. That coalition may be in the middle. That coalition may be left and far left. It may be right and far right. It may not be a particular left to right dimension. It's about building the biggest coalition. And so how it performs in a jurisdiction is just an artifact of like who can build the biggest coalition in that jurisdiction. It's not a Republican reform or a Democratic reform or a liberal or conservative reform or a moderates reform, right? It's about having more people represented. So back to the funding question, I do think that more people of means see the value in that proposition these days. I think a lot more people, regardless of their party affiliation, feel like the system just isn't working right and something needs to change. And so you see more people saying, I want more stability, I want more representative responsiveness, and maybe my side isn't going to win that. Maybe this person who gets elected isn't going to align with all my issue areas, but actually my number one issue area right now is kind of having this system best represent people. And my second and third issues, I recognize are my second and third issues, and they come after that, right? And so, you know, I'm hopeful that there will continue to be funding support, you know, for reforms like this, for organizations that are doing this work on the ground as well.
Okay, well, Mike Parsons, thank you very much for making the trip from Philadelphia. Let's give it up for Mike Parsons. Thanks a lot.